to rural economies. The rural economy holds significant potential for creating productive jobs and contributing to sustainable development and economic growth. It accounts for a significant share of employment and output in many developing countries, including Pakistan. It is important to equip young academics, researchers, and students with latest work related to rural economies and development. In this regard, a monthly webinar series is planned. The first webinar of this series is today, and the topic is a framework for analyzing the economic and institutional dynamics of underdevelopment. Despite having low advertisement for this opening webinar of the monthly international webinar series, we have received an overwhelming response, over 400 registrations from countries like Australia, Turkey, India, and Pakistan. Our panelist speaker for today's webinar is Professor Dr. Stephen Sklitzy, who obtained his PhD in economics in France, majoring in agriculture, resources, and energy, but was also laureate of École Normale Supérieure in Paris. I hope I have pronounced it well, Steve. Having
Yes.
read the humanities and the classics and languages, he previously obtained his baccalaureate in math and physics, a master's in sociology, and a bachelor's in international law. When working for the National Institute of Agricultural Sciences in Montpellier, he gained experience in Southeast Asia, Central Africa, and Central America. After joining UWA, he built on his experience in Vietnam by heading several research projects and leading a joint course between UWA and Vietnamese universities. Stephen Sklitzy is a professor of environmental and agricultural economics in the Faculty of Science at UWA, that is University of Western Australia. His work both in Australia and in Europe currently focuses on how public agencies can incentivize private landholders to supply environmental services like biodiversity protection or reduced air and water pollution, and on how equity concerns can be rigorously incorporated into environmental policies in trade-offs with other policy objectives. He has also worked in farm economics, risk management, energy economics, and system modeling. His preferred research tool has been economic experiments in the lab in connection with behavioral economics. He has authored or co-authored more than 100 scientific articles, 20 book chapters, and 4 books, including the most famous one, Natural Resources and Environmental Justice. His teaching and research supervision activities have included agricultural and environmental economics, development economics, energy and climate change, environmental management by business, and project and risk management. He has worked with PhD students on poverty, vulnerability to poverty, food security and food safety, renewable energies, and the economies of waste management. He has supervised or co-supervised about 20 PhD students as well as master's and honors students, often across different disciplines. In research too, he has often worked in multidisciplinary teams. His main interest has always been the interactions between geosystems, dynamics, and socioeconomic drivers and institutions. Last but not the least, Professor Sklitzy is my mentor. I completed my PhD under his kind supervision. And in my research achievements, Professor Sklitzy has a major role. So over to you, Professor Sklitzy, please.
Thank you very much, Khalid, for this very kind introduction. But regarding your achievements since you left UWA, they are totally and entirely due to your own efforts and your own skills. I have wanted to say that. So welcome everybody. Let's see if I can share my screen now. Let's see. There we go. Okay, so welcome everybody, wherever you are. It's a pleasure for me to have accepted Khalid Bashir's invitation to this series of seminars or webinars, they're called now, as they are often referred to these days. And it's also a particular pleasure that I am reconnecting with Khalid, whom I haven't actually seen or spoken with directly for quite a few years now. So thank you very much for inviting me. And without further ado, I shall start my topic. And so the title here is, as it says, the 5K framework, a tool for analyzing the dynamics of economic development or underdevelopment. And let me see, how do I go down now? Okay, there we go. And before I start, I would like to, from the start, highlight some key references that, if you are interested in this topic, would be very useful to you. There's a useful introduction paper by Goodwin, 2003, 5 Kinds of Capital, Useful Concepts for Sustainable Development. There are many papers actually on this topic, but I found that one a useful introduction. And more generally, regarding development and difficulties of development or underdevelopment, including many examples in the rural development context, I would highly recommend the reading of this book, Why Nations Fail, The Origins of Power, Prosperity and Property, by Acemoglu and Robinson in 2012. These are two very high-flying researchers. Acemoglu is an economist and an econometrician at MIT, and James Robinson is a political scientist at Harvard. And they've been working on this topic for over 20 or maybe 25 years and have summarized their experience into this book, which has a lot of very useful examples. So I'm sure that would be good background to this talk I'm going to give. Now, this topic that I'm sharing with you today has formed the backbone of a master's course that I've been teaching for several years now with my colleague here, Ram Pandit, Professor Ram Pandit, on economic development. And it seemed to have quite a lot of success with students. It helped us bring a lot of things together, and it seemed to be basically a useful framework to organize all the literature and the different topics that are very many and sometimes might appear a bit disconnected to students. And we thought, or at least I thought anyway, that it would probably be a good thing to share it with you as well. So we're talking about 5K, 5 forms of capital. Before going into that, maybe we need to remind what the notion of capital is. It is a highly discussed concept, of course, as probably most of you know, and it's been for maybe a century now, since the beginning, or at least the development of economics. And I won't go into that, but I will just keep the very basic idea that the notion of capital refers to a stock, material or not. So it could be buildings, machines, and so on, or money in the bank. That would be not material. It's a stock that generates an expected net benefit flow over a period of time. So it's a sum of benefits over time, and they are expected, so it's probabilistic, they're expected to be overall positive. That's what the word net stands for. There'll be costs and so on. That doesn't mean that after a few years, it actually has worked. Some people invest in new projects in capital and then to increase their capital stock, but it could happen that things go wrong and it doesn't work. So that's why the word expected is there. And I want now to illustrate here, there we go, what these 5 forms are. In the literature, I just want to tell you quickly that these 5 forms, first, you might find 6 or 7 different categorizations. It doesn't really matter, particularly under the issue of social capital. There are people talk of cultural capital and so on. It doesn't really matter. Then you can all put them together in that category. And also the term technical capital comes under the under other names like manufactured capital also. So different names, but the ideas are basically 5. So in terms of human capital, up at the top here, you have aspects related to health, and basically the capacity, so the capacity to generate a net benefit over time. So obviously the health of an individual as a worker, as a contributor to the economy, is going to, of course, to depend on how well fed he or she is, whether he can shelter from bad weather and so on, clothing, hygiene, including also mental health now these days, important. So that's one thing, more the physical or biological side, but also psychological and in the intellectual side, the education level, the skills, and their adequacy also to the job market, which means that the adequacy of their education or their skills to what the economy needs in terms of work. So this constitutes a group of characteristics that come under the heading of human capital. Regarding natural capital, which is very much an issue of work these days, as different countries try to bring that into their national accounts, includes things you're familiar with, soil fertility, for example, water quality, forest, but also minerals and energy. Technical capital has two aspects to it. One which we might consider as infrastructure, like roads, bridges, buildings, and so on, and could include hospitals and schools. Anyway, that all comes under buildings, and also machines in industry, in agriculture, but also in health, like X-rays, and of course vehicles of all sorts, and computers. All this comes under that category. Social, so I'll jump to financial capital first here. Financial capital will include everything that has value from a symbolic point of view. Of course, your savings in bank, but those are claims on other things. If all of a sudden there's extreme inflation, I'm sorry, that amount would disappear. Gold, jewelry, artworks, but also financial holdings. These all constitute financial capital. Social capital is the more recent concept, even though it's been around for 30 years or so, and is the most difficult to really grasp. It seems that it has two main aspects to it: ethical values, social norms, networks, and particularly social trust, the most important one, and institutions of the country, the law versus corruption, governance, incentive structures. And why do so? By the definition of capital, each one of these forms, when you increase its stock, it will increase the expected net benefit flows of the future. For four of them, it's relatively obvious. For social capital, you can think, in particular, that's the literature, that increased social capital under any form, what happens is it reduces transaction costs in particular, and therefore increases the productivity or the efficiency of the economy. There are quite a bit of literature on that. Having said this, each one of these five forms is a category. It's not a thing. So they each represent a family of different subtypes, and each has its own properties. However, the idea here, oops, sorry, I have to go back, is that it allows us to structure things, we'll see how, and help us organize the very complex situations that we have when we talk about economic development or rural development. You all know these are extremely complex issues. They're not linear, they're not simple, and we'll see some examples of this in a few slides. All right, so one thing I'd like to share with you is that it's quite helpful to bring all this into a diagram that I'll be using throughout this talk. The black circle around represents a system boundary. That is very important. You need to decide what your system boundary is. It could be a village, it could be a city, it could be a nation, or it could be part of a nation. But this has to be clear, because then you know what's inside and what's outside, which is important then to identify what are flows. Flows will go from one place to another, or from one system to another. These 5 forms of capital are stocks, and therefore they can increase or decrease over time, and they therefore lend themselves to different metrics. Depending on what type, within each you will have different metrics. So you won't have, I'll say a bit more in a minute, there could be different metrics, of course, for social capital as well as human capital and so on. The important thing I want to say here is that there is a qualitative aspect and a quantitative aspect. So for example, if you have, let's say, natural capital, and you're considering a forest, for example, you might think that there's a quantitative aspect in terms of area forested, or the amount or the number of trees, or how much wood there is there. Those are different metrics of a quantity. And at the same time, is the forest in good health, or is it sick, or has it been attacked by pests and so on? There's a qualitative aspect as well. So this is what I have symbolized by S of K. It's a state, it's a qualitative, but what is important to understand is that what I call a stock, well, what everybody calls a stock of capital, is the quantitative aspect, and it's part of what we can call a state. So state is more general. The state of an asset, if you want, will have quantitative and qualitative aspects. And by definition, a stock is measured at a certain point in time. A change in stock, or a change in the state of capital, of the asset, will be, of course, a function of time. The change in stock, the delta K here, will be related, of course, to flows. So again, if we come back to the forest, if you cut the trees and have wood and you take wood out, these are flows of wood coming out. The amount of forest will be reduced, that delta K will go down, but it doesn't mean that a flow, if you call it X, is going to be equal to the change in stock. That's important to keep in mind because there are inefficiencies. And therefore, the flow that actually comes out and goes into the economy or goes into the holdings of a particular business could be actually smaller than the change in forest, standing forest, because there would be inefficiencies, wood falling on the ground and being discarded, or in transport in any other way. All right, I hinted a bit earlier at measurement issues. Each form of capital can vary in their state as a function of a change in time, and they can vary, here I have to add, not just with corresponding flows, so wood was an example for a forest, but they can also vary in their qualitative state, here indicated by this delta S. For example, if the forest is poorly managed, if I'm taking natural capital here as an example, and the health of the trees will decline. So you have a reduced in the quality or of the state of that capital. As I said, the quantity of any stock of capital is only one of the attributes of its state. And therefore, the state that describes a type of capital will typically be a vector of attributes, and particularly a vector of valued attributes. And measuring or evaluating changes in each of the capital types will rely on the choice of attributes. So I really would like to emphasize here that it's important in this discussion to clearly understand that states, when they are stocks, are measured at a point in time, whereas flows of wood, for example, will be measured over a period of time. Social capital, of course, is challenging here because it has different facets, and some facets can be considered as more easily as capital. It will be a stock, but the metrics could be very different given the various aspects of social capital that I mentioned a bit earlier. All right, now Remember, I said deciding on the boundary of your system, whether it's a village, whether it's a nation, or whatever else, is important because it allows you to identify transboundary flows. And here are, for each one of the 5 Ks, examples. In human capital, you have migrations as well as knowledge transfers. They could be internal to your system. So if you take a country, for example, as your boundary, then you can have rural-urban migration. We know that's part of an important dynamic. You can have also between agricultural and industrial migrations as well, in terms of work and what that does to rural development, what it does to agricultural productivity as well. It could be external in terms of migrating out or migrating in. In natural capital, you have transboundary flows like climate change, air pollution, river flows, ocean level rises that can be caused by one country but suffered by another country, for example. Social capital refers therefore to international networks. They could be positive, like business links and scientific exchanges, but they could also be negative if you have criminal networks. Financial capital, that's quite obvious. Everybody knows it's financial flows. As flows, and naturally have loans, insurance, incurring debt, not debt itself, because that's part of financial capital with a negative sign in that case, but it's the increase or the decrease in debt and investments, which are, of course, variations of financial capital. Internationally, you would have trade and debt payments, remittances, foreign aid, and so on. In terms of technical capital, it refers to equipment and embodied technology transfers. By embodied is the technology that's inside the equipment, the machines. So you can think of exports, imports of machines, hardware, software, and designs. But also an interesting category here is infrastructure built in the country, or in the location, by hired foreign workers, which once they've built, they go back. This is, of course, linked to human capital, not necessarily positively, because then you can have a transfer, a physical transfer, technical transfer with a new equipment or new infrastructure, but the knowledge embodied in the human capital, the people basically, and the experts or whoever they are going back to their country. And so unless there is an agreement and some agreement between the host country and the country that sent was to transfer knowledge, which in this case would be part of human capital flows, not equipment, then there would be something that the host country would miss out. You will sometimes come across the notion of economic capital, which I'm not using, which seems to relate to the economy's level of economic development. But I will touch a bit on that a bit later. So in terms of transboundary flows, you can put them back on the diagram, and you can see for each one of them examples of what they are. So we're putting more into our diagram here, and that's how you can for any given case study, you would be able to do this. Now, I want to go a bit further, and oops, what has happened here? Excuse me, something happened. I'm not sure what happened. Right. Until now, I've spoken of these 5 capital forms on the same level. But in actual fact, if you look a bit closer, you'll see that they really come as 3 and 2 or 2 and 3, how you would like it. So that you have on the one hand, natural, human, and technical capital on the one hand, and then you have social and financial capital on the other hand. And perhaps the first you can qualify as, let's say, tangible, and the other ones are intangible. Anyway, in the literature, you will see that social and financial capital are often referred to as enablers, facilitators of the other 3. So, for example, I mentioned that a bit earlier, social capital will reduce transaction costs, will increase their efficiency, allow for more credible information to be exchanged between economic agents, allow for more cooperation. This all has important economic outcomes. Financial capital, of course, through loans and credit, allows for time bridges, bridging. You can't do it now. You borrow and then you give back, so obviously allows for investments and allows things to happen. So they translate into improvements into the other three forms of capital. There's also the fact that greater social capital, particularly in the form of trust, social trust, will allow increased financial capital, because with higher trust, you have greater willingness to take risks by parties to an investment, and therefore more willingness to invest together. So you have a bit of a game theoretic situation there, which has been studied in the literature quite a bit, but that's basically the idea. So now what I've done is I've created this black line in the middle, if you can see my cursor here, where you have those two, the 2K up at the top and the 3K down at the bottom. And you can see that they are affecting each of the lower 3K. The important thing though here is that there's a feedback loop here, a back action of human capital onto financial capital. In fact, you can see that this purple arrow here that comes from human capital is not actually directing to financial capital itself, the stock, but how it is used. So these three brown arrows, it's how these three brown arrows happen, which means how well is that financial capital invested. The same thing here, social capital affects financial capital also on those three arrows. How is it invested? So it's a movement. And so I think this diagram could be a guide for always reminding us when we're studying these issues of, say, investments in new equipment, of agriculture, if you want, to keep in mind these other interactions that are happening and decide how much you want to include them or not into your analysis. But if you don't include them, you know there's something that's going to be affecting your results that you want to keep in mind in order not to misinterpret your specific study. In addition to that, there are, in the lower half here of the diagram, you have strong interactions going on between these three tangible sorts of capital. So natural capital gives resources and energy to the physical capital, manufactured technical capital. Of course, it provides food, health, and also amenities for human capital. Human capital affects natural capital by knowledge, management capacity, affects all the machines, so by its uses, how well it is used, and also the efficiency, therefore, of the productive equipment. And this part here, depending on how it is used, can either restore natural capital or degrade it. So one can use natural resources, whether it's soils or forests, well or poorly. And whether it happens well or not, whether you're here in the degrading or restoring, very much depends on these interactions here, both direct interactions in the lower half and the indirect ones that come through the upper half. In addition, each one of these arrows down here in the lower half can be either positive or negative. So if, for example, technical capital, the machinery that is used, is used for restoring or is using natural capital in a sustainable way, then you can think that it's a positive sign here. Let's see that human capital then is feeding into that also positively. So these arrows could be both positive, or one could be negative and the other could be positive, or they could both be negative. So that's important in any study to make sure you know what's happening here and clarifying. And of course, you know that within these circles, there are many other sub-circles. So you might have to be more, to disaggregate that into whatever is relevant and pertinent for your case study. Right, now the resulting of all this working together is going to be in something that very broadly we tend to speak of as level of economic development. So depending on the interactions between these 5Ks and depending on the feedback loops, you can have something that is developing positively or that is not, so it's getting stagnated or even going in the negative. And you can actually, I just want to remind you, this is something that is not new, that level of economic development can have many indicators. It's not just economic growth in terms of GDP. It's more than that. So here are, I've divided them into what I call non-structural indicators, like basically scalar measures usually, and structural indicators, which are describe the structure of the economy or the agents contributing to the economy. So for example, things like sectoral or regional imbalances, degree of monopoly, the degree of market failure, the degree of government intervention in the economy to the extent can be measured, and things like balance of trades and so on. Right, now all this does not happen out of thin air. We have people making all this happen. So this diagram is just sort of summarizing what I've said here, where we have the role of the 2K, which affects the 3K, and then that together leads to either an increase or a decrease in the so-called level of economic development, depending on the metrics you've chosen, really happens with the role of agents, actions, and policies. Now, how does that happen? This happens mostly in the way that agents, actions, and policies, agents of economic agents, so consumers, producers, industries, farmers, and so on, households, they will affect all these interactions that I have been speaking about in ways that can either be positively dynamic or negatively dynamic. Now, by positively dynamic, I mean a dynamic of development, of growth in whatever metric, or it could lead to what is called as development traps, where the actions of one agent creates the incentive for another agent to behave in such a way that will reinforce the action of the first agent, and not just between two, but between any number. And of course, a typical example of that is corruption, for example, where it can create a situation where it's very difficult to come out of. It can also create here, you look at financial capital, a non-productive use of financial capital by financial reinvestments, where people have money and they just buy, they basically just speculate in the financial markets. And whatever profits are made in that way, they may or may not be invested then in human capital through education or hospitals, natural capital by replanting forests or rehabilitating ecosystems, or technical capital, investing in new machinery, new factories, and so on. So the important message here is to identify where are these feedback loops, identify where the existing development traps are, or even the potential development traps, and where are the positive dynamics that lead forward. But the important thing here, and that's here the power of this 5K framework, is that because of the interactions between all 5 of them, if there is one of them that is trapped, it is very likely that it will prevent all the other 4 from developing as well. So in a case study in a particular region, you want to identify where these dynamics are. How, first of all, is there one of these five that seems to be at the sort of driving it? That's not always the case. If there are, particularly, for example, over here, where you have a certain culture that has established itself between the actions of agents and social capital in terms of lack of trust and bad experience, then that will create expectations that others will treat, others will lie and not follow on their promises or contracts and so on. But it's very difficult to know where it starts. So you have this development trap tends to be is a dynamic feedback loop. So it also tells you that you cannot usually solve a problem in one. Let's say if you imagine you're looking at environmental degradation here, the natural capital quality going down, you cannot solve that independently of all the other the four categories and their interactions with agents and policies. So this means your study has to think of these, and it may not be able to deal with all of them, but you need to keep in mind what the role is. So I'm coming to the end here of my talk. Okay, I want to spend some time so people can ask questions. What happens here is that interaction here with the result on economic development, which also then feeds back in terms of most of institutions that define the incentive structures and disincentive structures as well, will have an important role. So I'm going to finish here by relating what I've just said to the Sustainable Development Goals. And as you know, there are 17 of them as 2030 targets. Many of these are relevant to rural development, given that I know your interest is primarily in that area. And I would encourage you as an exercise to relate each of the ones that you find most relevant to rural development to the 5K framework in a specific context of your choice. And if you do this, remember to first define your system boundary very clearly. So you could do this from wherever you are, looking at a particular village or a district or a region, like a province, or the whole country. But you need to be specific. As I said, that defines the flows that go in or out of your system. And of course, that affects both the quality and the quantity of your capital stocks, whether they go up or whether they go down. Right, here's my last slide. So having said all this, how are different ways to use this tool, given that it's only a tool or a framework? The first thing I think is that it helps you question what is happening, question the development paths, or some cases underdevelopment, depending on what your problem is. And it allows you to question your problem with a solutions-oriented focus. How does that happen? That's the second point, is by allowing you to identify the dynamic interactions that can lead or have led either to development traps or to specific development paths. If you identify development traps, then the question becomes, are there any exit dynamics? I really insist on the word dynamics because of all these interactions. So what are the possible exit dynamics? In some cases, it may be that there are no exit dynamics. For example, the country or the village or the region itself cannot, because of the development traps, come out of them come out of the hole, if you want, by themselves. They need help from outside, whether it's foreign aid or whether it's whatever other or intervention by the top government, if it's a local area. but that's something that needs to be identified and understood. Why? Secondly, if it is, you identify development paths, then you'd like to compare them to alternative feasible paths. And those by feasible means they are compatible with the dynamics and the interaction dynamics with the 5K forms. The third point is that, as I said at the very beginning, development is not a simple thing, and we don't often find simple linear causality, like A causing B, causing C, causing D. That's not how things work. Rather, the fact that A influences B could be itself conditioned on C, which could itself be conditioned on D. That's the top thing just next to number 3. But even that is usually not the case. It's more the little diagram that I have here. So what happens here is you may observe A to affect B in a certain way if C is in a certain state, and A would affect B in another way if C is in a different state. But then again, the influence on A and B, or rather, the influence on how A affects B of C itself could be conditioned on D, E, and the mutual interaction. So this framework pushes you to identify these nonlinear or hierarchical causal relationships. And then the fourth point is identifying the positive and negative dynamics. Remember, like a positive was restoring a forest, the negative would be degrading it. You have binary ones, and you might even have more than binary ones. In some cases, you would have ternary ones, in other words, between 3 forms of capital. And it wouldn't happen only between forms of capital, but of course, it could also happen within forms of capital, because, as I said, each of the 5 forms is a category that includes subcategories that themselves could have interactions, positive or negative. There, I would like to end by signaling another book which I have found very useful also in my teaching, which is Diagnostic and Solutions Oriented. It's a little book, not a textbook, but it can be used like that. It's more for advanced students, I would say, by Bruce Riddick, called Games in Economic Development. The term games refers to game theory, but really the book is about what I've just uses game theory as well, is about all these dynamic interactions and feedback effects that I've mentioned. And I'm finishing here, and I'd like to thank you for your attention. I'm very happy to take any questions.
Thank you very much, Stephen, for a very wonderful and thought-provoking presentation. I would like to open the house for questions. First, Professor Dr. Mohammad Ashfaq, who so I think I can't see him now. Are you there, sir? Okay, Mohammad Zubair. Yes, sir. Dr. Ashfaq, please.
Yes, could you hear me?
Yes.
Yes.
Thank you very much. First of all, this is Ashfaq. I'm a visiting faculty at the University of Faisalabad. And first of all, I would like to appreciate Dr. Khalid Bashir, for organizing such a wonderful series. And thank you very much, Steve, for sparing your valuable time and giving us a very, interesting webinar, the first webinar. I have a couple of questions and comments. I like your 2K and 3K approach and the linkages which were developed among all the case and particularly the binary interactions. My question is just for, making it more clear, could you please throw a light more on development traps? And second is in Pakistan, the Imran Khan government is very much, talking about the social capital, and they are giving more emphasis, rather than taking all the capital together, but they are giving more emphasis on social capital. So keeping in view your experience of the developing countries, how you will, comment on this, and whether, in a country like Pakistan, we need to put more emphasis on social capital, or we need a balanced, approach. Thank you very much.
I didn't, the sound went out for the first part of the question. The first question you had, there's a word I missed, but that was the key word. Could you please repeat it? Because I didn't hear it.
Steve, I was, talking about the development traps. Could you please throw more light on development traps? And second is on social capital, because Imran Khan government is giving more emphasis on social capital rather than to have a balanced, approach. Is it okay?
Right. Yes, I understood that. Maybe I'll start with the second question first, that the Pakistan government is putting emphasis on social capital. Of course, it depends which aspect of social capital they have in mind, because it could relate to many different things. So I don't know. But in the first part of the answer here is that it will not be independent. What happens at the social cap, whether you're talking about social trust, whether you're talking about forming productive networks, whether it's about the rule of law and, for example, reducing corruption, for example, it will not be operating independently of other aspects. So, for example, let's take an example that is very much discussed now in the literature. There's a big literature on how to reduce corruption, because every country has that. So here's an example between, let's say, the financial aspects and the social aspect. If an employee of government, could be a police officer or someone in the administration, is paid very little or has very low expectations of progress, even if they work hard, okay, then there will be a strong incentive to try to get money from other sources, and that is qualified as corruption. So here's an example where the financial aspect and the social aspect are very strongly related. They could also be related to human capital. Maybe that person in that position doesn't have a high enough level of education, but that itself then is going to be the consequence of something. Of course, we're not talking about one individual. We're talking of the fact that there's a lot of them in that situation. So it's a structural aspect. So here's an example where even if you were to consider that aspect of social capital, you would have to include necessarily the financial aspects and the human educational aspects as well. So it also points to the fact that there is rarely a quick fix, something that you can do in 1 year. Often means modifying several things at the same time. So it's a policy package in those cases, and that will take time. We're talking a decade rather than a year here, something like that. So I'm not sure that answers your question or not, but I guess it goes on to, yes, you can't do that independently of other aspects, which I mentioned, like other 4 aspects of capital. Regarding development traps, that has been studied quite a bit, and the best way to understand it is in terms of dynamic game theory, in particular in terms of expectations. So you have equilibria, basically a development trap corresponds in the language of game theory to an equilibrium between different individuals or agents that have expectations of each other such that it is in the interest of no one to change the system. By definition, that's an equilibrium situation. So for example, if someone, again, let's go back to this idea of either corruption or something equivalent, if someone doesn't do it, someone else will be called on. And so nature abhors the void. What happens, it becomes a cost to the individual not to play by whatever rules are happening at that time. In certain cases, for example, if someone wants to go against the corrupt system, wants to be a whistleblower, it will usually be at a high cost to him or herself. And anyway, someone else could be willing to come and take their place. So the benefit cost balance for any individual separately is not going to be positive. It's going to be negative. So that's how this situation is understood and modeled. Of course, that's just part of it, but I don't know whether I'm answering your question here, but it's been studied a lot in those terms.
Thank you, Stephen, for a very detailed answer. Anyone else? There are a couple of questions which I have already answered through that. The last question was on our question answer about what you are talking about right now. So there is one question that how can we clear all diseases from plants? That is not directly related to this. Anyhow, would you like to respond, sir? How can we clear all diseases from plant which never attack again on plants?
Oh, okay. Ooh, that's a
That's
yes, that goes.
directly plants agriculture.
Yes, yes. It goes. Okay, let me think a bit. The reference to never any diseases on plants actually goes beyond this talk. It has to do with understanding the biology and the ecology of plants. So it's very much dependent on biological science, plant science, and we may not know everything. In fact, we certainly don't know everything yet, right? So part of the answer has got to do with science and knowledge, and therefore investment in increasing that knowledge. So part of that answer, which goes through the science, is, well, how much investment, not just directly in money, but also in training people to become experts in plant diseases. What incentives are there in the economy for people, secondly, for people to want to choose to become experts in that area? Maybe they prefer to go work for a company and do marketing or something. So there are many different answers to that question. It's a very big question. It really depends on what are the causes right now that allow. I would rather ask the question a bit differently, really. I would say it's a more practical question to say, why are there so many plants today in a particular region, perhaps in Pakistan, that have diseases and are obviously then reducing yields and creating problems for food security and so on like that. So asking that question that way becomes much clearer and easier to understand. So why are there so many diseases? There are many possibilities. One, I said there may not be enough knowledge. That's the research aspect, which I just mentioned. Secondly, there are chemicals or perhaps certain new technologies like what's it called? These special new techniques that don't require herbicides or pesticides. And that could then be linked to the financial aspect. So there's not enough money for farmers or local agencies to purchase the chemicals that are needed that could help the reduce crop infestation. It could also be that there's a human capital aspect. It could be that farmers themselves don't diagnose the problems on time because they're not educated enough to understand what kind of disease is going on, as well as not enough people who may know about the plants but are not part of the extension services. So they are maybe working in laboratories, in universities or private companies, but in the extension services that are supposed to go and help farmers on the farm, there aren't enough people who know about this. So there's a whole, as you can see, you can use this diagram to as a framework to ask all the questions, and then then you go and try to see what is the situation in each situation, how they affect each other. So I don't know, I would start by thinking of it that way. Rather that way, I would say. First of all, why is the situation that which we observe today? And obviously we would like it to be different, we'd like it to be better. In this case, less plants being affected. That's how I would approach the problem.
Okay, thank you very much again, Steve. There are two more participants who are interested in questions. First, Dr. Khalid Mushtaq, and then Mr. Mohammed Dawood. So Dr. Khalid Mushtaq, please first.
Assalamu alaikum, it's Mohammed Dawood. So can you please tell me?
Yes, we can hear you.
Can you please tell me about environmental climate change? As Prime Minister of Pakistan talks more about climate change in a World Economic Forum and other forums. So what do you think about can the steps taken by Imran Khan will best regarding climate change, and other how can climate change affect Pakistan as well as other countries? Thank you.
Khalid, the sound was very muffled. It was difficult.
Okay, I will explain the question. First, take the question from Khalid Mushtaq. Sir, please.
Yeah, it's my question. It's not a question. It's a bit just my comment. That when we go through you have already mentioned the book Why Nations Fail, and the conclusion is that the nations who have inclusive, social, political, and economics institutions, they were on the path of development. And one of the political institutions, the example is being given the democratic governments, But when we see across the globe, except few developed countries, and the experiment of democracy is failed in most of the countries of the world. So even in the developed countries where democratic institution is working, it's not serving the whole general masses. It is basically serving the elite. So can you have some bit comment on that?
This is an interesting question. It's actually a question that the last chapter, or the last two chapters of that book I mentioned, Why Nations Fail, actually it focuses on that question specifically. I'm not sure I can actually answer it here. It's not a small question. It does come down to what is currently, from what I understand, a very hot but unsolved question in development economics, which is, how do you deal with a situation where the elite in a country, or in any system, but let's say country here, elite in a country do not have the incentive to improve the economic, let's say the economic level of the country, because they benefit from the current situation. They hold the power to change things. They probably hold the government and so on. They have the money, but they don't have an incentive to change the situation, which is not satisfactory for the rest of the population. Now, this is a question that current development economists are puzzling over, thinking about. And to be right now, the last chapter by these two authors actually ends by saying we don't have an answer to that question right now, other than strong influences coming from outside the system, outside the boundary. So if that is a nation, it would be from other nations or from the international community. So the short answer to your question is that we don't know. We don't know yet, but a lot of people are working on it. And so I would say that in the next few years, the next maybe 5 or 10 years, I don't know, there'll be progress made on how to deal with the situation, because even game theory is not enough to reason that problem through. I would say keep an eye on that area. Things are going to progress, but right now I think we don't have the answer.
Thank you, Professor. Thank you. Thank you.
Okay, Steve, there was a question from Dawood, and it was basically about how climate change affects Pakistan as well as other countries. That was basic question, I think. Am I right, Dawood? Were you asking the same thing? Whether he is there or not. The question was very simple and general question, that how climate change is affecting developing countries.
That is a bit outside the topic I was presenting. It's a very broad topic, but I cannot answer it here. It's not the topic I am talking about, because how does it affect? It could be purely in terms of environmental science, right? So what is it? We have to measure the impacts and then the economic consequences of that. There's many aspects to a question like that. It's too general. One would need to be more specific. The only thing I can say is that it can correspond to the framework in terms of transboundary flows, in terms of natural capital, right? So there are influences, environmental influences affecting Pakistan from the outside. System boundary now is the country of Pakistan, that are, I suppose, mostly hurting Pakistan in terms of agricultural yields, probably droughts and people's health as well. I guess that's the link, but it's still too general. I cannot answer a question like that. One will need to be more specific.
Yes, you are absolutely right, because it was very general and it was out of the scope of 5 Ks of development.
I mean, it could be that the intent of the question, I don't know, could be that like other countries are creating problems for Pakistan through their greenhouse gas emissions, which is certainly a reality, a fact. But I'm not sure, once you've said this, what the question is.
Yes, you're right. Anyone else from Dr. Tahira Sadaf? I think she's trying to explain the question. Can you please ask the question yourself? Uh, okay. Okay, Nazim Ali, please.
Thank you. I'm Nazim Ali. I work with the United States Agency for International Development, and usually we are, we are constrained with the amount of money we have, time, and interventions we have in our menu. So, do you have any example of?
Sorry, Nazim. Nazim, please. Your mic is off right now. Nadia Ali, can you please open? Yes, Nazim Ali. Please continue, please.
Yeah, I'm from USAID, US Agency for International Development, and we have like limited resources. So, do you have any example of successful model where we have, and most of the developing countries, they have limited resources, and they have a very limited choice as well, that whether they should spend on human capital, on technical capital, or something. So do you have any successful model, or have you ever seen in the history that any country with the limited resources came out of this development trap, or can improve the lives of the people? So any example from your like studies? Thank you.
Okay. Yes, there are many examples actually. The first thing I would need to say though first is that already, if the question of your organization is should we invest more in human capital or technical capital or whatever it is, asking the question like that already is not going to be very helpful, because if you apply the methodology of this framework is suggesting the question that needs first to be asked is, what are the dependencies? So there's a situation where you can call it either underdevelopment, or maybe there is a development trap. Unravel, identify the interactions between all 5 categories of capital. This is the first thing. It's not this or this or this. Ideally, it's going to be, you're going to find an entry point, whether it's starting to build more schools or train more people, if human capital is the better entry point, or it's going to be get local villagers to improve the way they manage their natural resources locally, their soils, their water. It's not going to be one or the other. You might choose one entry, but you're going to choose that entry, that means like one of the 5, because you've understood how that one could lead to a positive chain of impacts on the other 4, or using or the 4 or 2 or 3, whichever are at work in that area. So already I would not ask the question that way. Then the next thing is, so if it turns out, let's say that financial capital is the best entry, given the analysis you've done of the situation, which means that the others tend to depend on that. That means the next goal is try to find financial capital to start this. Now, it will be much easier to find either investors or even donors if you are able to show that putting money, the financial capital in this area, in this region, is going to have a follow-on effect in terms of human capital, natural capital, and so on. It shows that you understand what the dynamics are locally, and that this amount of money, financial capital, put in is going to be productive. It's going to have follow-on effect rather than being lost. Lots of times happens, money is put in an area and it's not used well because people haven't thought of the other aspects, and it just gets wasted basically. That's one thing. That's the first part. The second part, are there examples? I think your question was where, with limited resources, things have been quite successful. Off the top of my head, I would say yes, there are many of them. In that book that I mentioned, there's a number of examples. They're positive examples, not just negative ones. One interesting case, a bit ironic today, given the situation of Brazil, is that 10 years ago, I think it was, a positive loop happened in Brazil in terms of local and rural development, with actually very little financial input. And interestingly, it did not come from outside. It actually came from within the Brazilian community. So that's a very good example to look at. Of course, since then, things have gone in a different direction in the last 2 or 3 years. But in that book, I mentioned it's described. You also have quite a number of projects done, particularly by non-governmental organizations, NGOs, that are quite successful with small resources. In this case, we're talking about financial, but also few people. Of course, there are many that fail as well, but there are successes. So I would say, I mean, if we wanted to, I could look for some and then send them to Khalid, and he would give them to you. Right now, I don't have them in my mind, but the answer is yes, there are quite a lot of them.
Thank you. So, so that means, as you mentioned, Brazil, or maybe I have seen other countries as well. There should be, or another factor in the 5K, that's leadership. That sometimes one person comes in the power and changes whole of the dynamic of the society and all 5Ks in a certain way that either it's all goes well, very well, or it all goes down. So maybe we should introduce another thing, maybe may not be K, but overall as a leadership role of certain person, party, or something that gives a direction to whole of the system, or maybe within a boundary. Thank you.
You're absolutely right. But I would argue that this framework takes that into account. First, because there is that category of agents, decisions, and government policies. So that's important. It's very central. But that's one part of the answer. The other part of the answer is that a leader does not fall from the sky. He is accepted and pushed forward by a lot of other people. So a leader, in my view, is not someone who is rowing upstream, like in a boat, rowing upstream, trying to bring people upstream. He's actually has understood in which direction the river is flowing and has decided to flow down the river and take people with him. So in that case, I would say that no matter what the nature of the leader, whether it's one person or whether it's a group of people, they are just reflecting. They're reflecting the situation. They're reflecting the, first of all, there'll be social capital for sure. Look, what are the values, the trust, the expectations of people, but they are also reflecting the incentive structures, which is also part of social capital, the institution, the incentive structures. And by what I mean by incentive structures, what do different categories of people want? And of course, those who have more money, more power, the weight on what they want is greater. So I would tend to see the action of leaders more as a reflection of the dynamics that are going on and the interactions between different subgroups than as something coming from, you know, just falling from the sky. In ancient times, you could have very exceptional people, you know, you've been thinking of Genghis Khan or Napoleon or things like that. But even them, they were okay, very history-changing people. So you do get these once a while, but very few of them. normally leaders, especially these days where things are more complicated, they tend to, and they usually need to actually, it's very difficult to imagine doing something alone without having a lot of people supporting you. So the reason they're supporting you is that there's a confluence of interests or expectations which reflect how these different types of capital are distributed. So this is something that you have brought up that I didn't mention, because I didn't mention everything, is the distribution issue, the distribution of the different forms of capital, who has what, and so on. And the distribution also is important. But yes, I couldn't talk about everything, but you're right. That's important.
Thank you, sir. Thank you very much.
Can I ask a question, please?
Yes.
So my question is, it's Mohammad Daud, and my question is how to overcome these issues. Number one, income disparity, trade deficit, and the last one is public debt. How to overcome these issues, as these issues majorly faced by underdeveloped countries or developing countries.
Okay, Steve.
Okay, the sound doesn't come across very easily. It was muffled for me.
And that was basically underdevelopment, debt burden. What was the other thing, Daud?
Three things: trade debt, oh,
Trade deficit.
is
We can't hear you. The one is trade deficit, the other one is debt burden, and the third one is
and income disparity. How
income
to overcome
disparity.
these issues?
And income disparities. There are three things: debt burden,
Income
income
disparity.
disparity. Okay,
Yes,
got
sir.
it. Steve.
Okay, so these seem to be macroeconomic questions relating to the whole country. All right, so the first two was debt,
Debt burden.
debt burden, and what the other one was? The first
Trade
two?
deficit.
Okay, okay. Of course, they could be related, right? All right, those two questions are related, and are a classical. It's a classical question in development economics. So it's narrower than what I've been talking about, and there's a big literature on that. So I don't have anything new to say regarding that. However, we understand how a country will get indebted and so on, but I would say I'll try to answer within the context of this talk is how can the framework that presented can be useful if you identify that a country is increasing its debt and maybe have a trade deficit. Okay, these two are usually strongly connected. Why is this happening? So the question now becomes something going on within the country, and there's also the relationship with the other country. But the answers are actually could be very many. There are many different possible situations here. Okay, let's get rid of the second part first. The relationship with the other country. It may depend on what kind of agreements or lack of agreements there might be with the other country with whom this country is exporting or importing, right? So they're having a trade deficit because of what they're exporting and what they're importing and the prices that are being used then. That could depend on the kind of relationship agreements, and that could depend on many things. It could include geopolitics, it includes agreements or lack of agreements in other areas. So I cannot say anything on that one, right? But on the other hand, why does a situation like that continue? The question then becomes, within the country, what's preventing the different players, industries, the farmers, the processors, the exporters, from changing. So for example, if they are exporting products that are not priced in such a way that will allow the country to make a greater income, then the question becomes, why are they continuing to produce this product? Why don't they switch, change to another product, whether it's agricultural or industrial? And now that that becomes interesting, you know, given whatever agreements you have with the other countries, that's outside here now, then you start asking, you could use the 5K framework to start asking what is preventing the change? So here is a situation of a blockage, right? I don't know whether it would be a development trap or not. If it is, then you have a dynamic feedback existing, but it could just be some constraint that is there. Maybe, for example, there isn't the technology to switch from product A to product B. Why isn't there that technology? So now you start looking around. What's the constraint to that? So as I said, when you look at the top of the diagram in the last slide, it said development you had incentives and constraints. I didn't talk a lot about constraints, but that's another aspect. You identify where the constraints are. So these are not dynamic feedback loops. They're like walls, if you want. And the question becomes, why are they there? What's preventing that constraint from being lifted? So that's how I would use the diagram to, to go backwards with these why questions, to then, and using the diagram as a guide, basically, to identify where the constraints are, and also where are the possibilities. So where are also the resources in terms of the five types of capital that the country can use to lift that constraint. So yeah, it could be in terms of technology. It could be in terms of, sometimes it could be something, for example, the structure of property rights, the structure that production is done on by people who don't own the land but are working for someone else. Then you have an incentive problem there. There's no incentive to apply the latest techniques or incentive to use them efficiently, right? So I'm just taking some examples here to illustrate that.
So what do you think about the sectoral imbalances?
I think, Daud, it is time, because the structural imbalances or balance of payments are not directly related to the 5 Ks of development. Basically, we were talking about the development
It's
models.
basically prevention.
We can have discussion.
Prevention economic.
You can contact me
Okay.
for that.
May
You
I have a
can
question,
contact
sir?
me.
May I have a question, sir?
I think you can discuss it with me later on, but we are getting out of time. We have already
Okay, sir.
taken a lot of time from Dr. Stephen. On the behalf of Institute of Agricultural and Resource Economics and ORIC and University of Agriculture, Faisalabad, would like to extend a warm thanks to Professor Dr. Stephen Stiglitz for a very thought-provoking discussion today. And thank you to all the participants and the questions which were directly or indirectly related to the talk. Hope to see you in a second webinar next month. Thank you very much once again, Steve.
Thank you very much to you, Khalid, and thank you everybody for a lot of interesting questions, which were quite big. So I didn't have really time to answer all of these. They were very big questions, but I'm quite happy to, either through Khalid or perhaps directly, I'm quite happy to answer any further questions you might have, or give you directions to references that might be of use to you.
Thank you very much, and see you in next webinar next month. Thank you once again.
Thank you.